Happy Monday. Hope everybody's safe. Hope everybody's doing well. All right, as we get our class started this morning, I just want to express gratitude and thanks to Dr. David and Smadar Seinfeld for sponsoring this morning's learning commemoration of the yahrzeit of David's beloved mother, Bella Seinfeld, Bella Bas Avram Abba. Aliyah Shalom, her neshama should have an aliyah, and in the merit and the schus of our studying together, it should be a schus of merit for the entire family. So I thank them both and family for their generosity. Okay, so an interesting topic this morning, really the ethics of part of so much conversation that's existing in the world today. And we're going to see it in the case that we're going to discuss. And again, like we always do, all of these cases are opportunities for us to try to figure out where they apply, not only in the specifics of what we're studying, in the immediacy of the case we're discussing, but also knowing where it applies in other areas as well. And the area that this applies in, current events is the conversation that's existing now in the world about, skipping the line. There's been so much discussion about how the vaccine has been for those who are interested in getting the vaccine, how it has been disseminated, and some of what has been very disorderly about how it's been disseminated. And I know this has been a conversation I've shared with many in our community over the past number of weeks, and the struggle that it has been for so many who really desperately want to get it and are in a certain category and are just having a great difficulty getting it. And that has a lot to do with, the websites and the emails and the crashing of the websites largely because the volume has been so very, very high. I mean, literally last night I got 3 different websites that were just made available, and I sent them out to the number of individuals who have been really asking desperately to try to see how they can get it. And within minutes, it seemed as if, although it wasn't minutes actually, but it wasn't, very, very long. Maybe it was 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The whole thing was, filled up and crashed. Actually, the sites actually crashed. So just then that lends into the conversation of, who gets first, who gets second. What if a person's able to get it in another way? Is there a moral, ethical dilemma called the line jumping? Is there a problem with that? Is there an issue with that? What if the distinction is one, that the administrators of the vaccine, for example, are themselves not following the guidelines of 65 plus or 75 plus or immunocompromised population, whatever it is? So is it a function of do you have a moral obligation independent of the people who are representing the moral obligators? Or what happens in a situation, the difference between the current, vaccines that are made available, the Pfizer and the Moderna. The Pfizer has a very short shelf life. So let's just say you find out that there's a certain place they're giving the vaccine and they were expecting to give, 25 doses to individuals, and only 20 people showed up. So there's 5 extra dosages been made available. So it seems that there's 5 extra dosages available. So are you able to take that dosage if you have that connection, knowing that probably what they're going to do is they're going to throw them away? My brother, who's a doctor in New York, told me that unfortunately in the state of New York, there have been so many findings where there were extra dosages that were not administered. Why? Because they didn't have people that were in that certain bracket, that category. So some of the dosages were then discarded, which is heartbreaking to think about the fact that there are lines and lines of people who are desperately wanting to get it. So the ethics of line jumping or jumping the line, right? Of course, where does it fall in halacha? Does it find itself in a specific application as relates to getting a vaccine? What if you're able to, because of connections, able to get it? Is there something wrong with that? So we'll just open the floor to that this morning. Anybody want a comment, question before we get into our case a little bit? Okay, so let's just jump right into it. Okay, so the case here that we're going to discuss this morning, and again, let's use that as the backdrop here to try to understand the ethics. Can you force yourself into the front of the line? Are you able to force yourself into the front of the line? So that's true in a vaccine situation, and that's true in halacha as well. Now, some of you and I, we've studied some of this a little bit in the past, but this is just an interesting case that you have in the source material before you. This is, again, we're following Shulchan Aruch, we're following the Code of Jewish Law, and we're using and citing the sources in contemporary, not only contemporary halacha, but in the Gemara and the Chazal, the teachings of the Chachamim, to try to understand what this answer could be. So let's begin with the case. The case is as follows. La'achar HaShoah, after the Holocaust, this is in the source material that you have before you, after the Holocaust, Hevi Ha'admor Miklosenberg, there was the Rebbe from Klosenberg, the Klosenberger Rebbe, Aga tzitzios echad. He was able to get a bundle of tzitzis. Now, this is, again, we've been discussing the tzitzis topic. Last week we did this, the Mesiras Nefesh versus the, Talis No'eh, the extreme enhancement because of how much the tzitzis were obtained. That, of course, we studied previously. And the only reason why it's on the tzitzis topic is because, again, it's following in Shulchan Aruch, and this is in these first Simonim, in these first chapters, discussing the mitzvah of tzitzis. Now, there's the laws of tzitzis, the big, what a daled kanfos, a beged, a four-cornered garment is, how you wrap the tzitzis, what the symbolism of all the strings are. But here's like just a practical case of where you see a situation where maybe there's an ethical component to it as well. So here the case is that the Klosenberger Rebbe, after the Holocaust, he had a bundle of tzitzis. And the reason why this bundle of tzitzis, he was able to have it, he was able to rescue it, he was able to, now do something with it. So kedei litnu le'echad ha'pleitim, he was able to give it to any of the refugees. Here they were in DP camps after the Holocaust, and so many of them were so either wanting to, or even if they didn't want to, he wanted to be able to expose them and to invite them to be able to do mitzvos again, as they once did. So they were very, very connected to wanting to do the mitzvos in a previous time, and over the disaster and the horrors of the Holocaust, that was no longer. So what happens? So that there was a tremendous passion, there's a tremendous desire, a tremendous ratzon, a tremendous want of the plaitim, of the refugees. They wanted to have the merit, the schus, to have a pair of tzitzis. So there's this wool, and they were going to have to spin it and weave it. So Nigash HaBachar, there's a certain fellow, I guess we'll keep him, his name is there, Mendel Pshitik, so that's his, we don't know who he is in any specifics, but that's his name. So so he was one of the Hasidim. V'kores chultzosa hayechida. He did something to try to. He realized something, that there's not that much wool. There's not enough tzitzis to go around to everybody, and he's not sure how he's going to get the tzitzis. He wants the tzitzis, right? Person wants the vaccine, for example, right, in contemporary case study. So he wants the vaccine, or he wants, in this case, he wants the tzitzis, so he doesn't know how he's going to get it. Maybe he's going to have to wait a long time till he gets the tzitzis. Maybe he's not going to be able to get the tzitzis at all. So he decides he's going to do something, he's going to outsmart the system, and he's going to take his garment. He's got one garment. He's got one remaining garment, and he's going to rip it. He tears this garment. You know what he does? He tears it in such a way that he now creates a four-cornered garment. Now, that's a very important point here, which is a person is obligated in tzitzis, but a male is only obligated in tzitzis if you have a four-cornered garment. If you don't have a four-cornered garment, then you're not obligated in tzitzis. You do not have the obligation to wear tzitzis on a three-cornered garment or a no-cornered garment, right? If you're wearing a T-shirt, for example, that doesn't have corners on it, you don't have an obligation to wear tzitzis. Now, if you have a choice, then of course, you try to choose a garment that has that, or we have a talis katan, a specific garment that we put on, individual and specific, nothing to do with the garment that we're wearing. But certainly, if you're wearing a garment and you don't have tzitzis, and you didn't live in the times like they sell tzitzis independently, so if you didn't have a four-corner garment, you didn't have an obligation to wear tzitzis. So that's what's interesting here, is that in those cases, obviously they didn't have an Eichler's, they weren't able to buy it online, they weren't able to go to the local store. So they didn't have, how are they going to do it? So maybe there was going to be one beged that was going to be used as a pair of tzitzis, as they're going to be used as the garment to put the tzitzis on. So he decided, I got one garment that doesn't have four corners. I'm going to tear it in such a way that it's going to now have four corners. And once you have a beged, a garment that has four corners, so then you have an obligation. It's like you have a house. Once you buy a house, you have an obligation to put a mezuzah on your house, right? So once you have a garment that's four-cornered, then you have an obligation to put tzitzis on it. Everybody else, they didn't have such a garment, but he also didn't have such a garment, but he figured out a way for him to have such a garment. So now, in his tearing of his own garment, a singular garment, and now he has a garment that's obligated in tzitzis. The Rebbe says to the Rebbe, now that he's wearing a garment that is a four-cornered garment, Yeshlo din kadima. He has to now skip the line. He has to be in front of the line. He's now first because he's an obligation. I have an obligation that's a biblical obligation. He forced his way. He was able to figure out a way. Now, is there any crime in that? Is there any misgiving in that? Is there anything dishonest about that? No, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Maybe we would say that it's not. He just figured out a way to be obligated more than everybody else. And therefore, since he was obligated more than everybody else, then he should take his place at the front of the line. Because here he has a four-cornered garment. Whereas everybody else, everybody else who wants to have a pair of tzitzis, they should eventually they'll have a garment of four corners, but they don't have it now. So if they don't have it now, their obligation is not the same as my obligation. The question is he correct? Was it correct for him to do that? What do we respond? How do we rule? We know that there are a lot of different areas in halacha where even though everybody has an obligation, but nonetheless, there are situations where a person's obligation is different because of their status. And I'm not talking about where one's a gadol and a katan, for example. Okay, so for example, you have a child and an adult. A child obviously is not obligated the same way that an adult is. But even in the world of an adult, I'll give you an example. One of the famous and most regular examples is whether or not, there's different statuses. So let's just use Kiddush Friday night or Havdalah on Motzei Shabbos. Let's start with Kiddush Friday night. What's the example of Kiddush Friday night? So the Kiddush example Friday night is when we go to shul Friday night. When anybody goes to shul Friday night, so we say Vayichulu Hashemayim v'ha'aretz v'chol tzva'am. We daven and we say Baruch Mekadesh Shabbos. We say blessed is the sanctity of the Shabbos. What we do when we do that is we accept the Shabbos. We pronounce the Shabbos. Right? We're makabel the Shabbos d'oraisa, biblical. Right? There's a biblical obligation. I mentioned before that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal, he used to go around Shari Chesed and he would say good Shabbos to people, hoping that they would respond by saying Shabbat Shalom, good Shabbos. Because if you just simply acknowledge the Shabbos on some major, just basic level, the basic level is that it's a kiyum d'oraisa. So you fulfill the biblical obligation of Zochar Yom HaShabbos HaKodsho. Now, that's the biblical obligation. But what about the additional obligation? The additional obligation that the person has is the rabbinic obligation. The Rambam Maimonides writes that in addition to simply acknowledging the Shabbos, we celebrate the Shabbos by making Kiddush Friday night over a cup of wine. Shabbos day over a glass or a cup of wine or a cup of grape juice. So that is an obligation which is established by the rabbis. And that means you, in essence, have a dual obligation. You have an obligation d'oraisa, an obligation that's d'rabbanan, one that's biblical, one that's rabbinic. And it's true that if you didn't go to shul Friday night, this is certainly not an advocacy to do that, but if you didn't go to shul Friday night and you just made Kiddush at your table, so you will have satisfied both. You would say, Baruch Mekadesh Shabbos, and did the d'oraisa and the d'rabbanan all in the same time. But usually that's not what happens. Usually, the men go to shul, they say Baruch Mekadesh Shabbos. Some of the ladies daven at home, Baruch Mekadesh Shabbos. And then they fulfill their biblical obligation. And what they do when they say Kiddush when they come home is for rabbinic reasons. They fulfill their obligation of Kiddush b'makom suda, Kiddush at the table, the meal that you're having at the table. That's Kiddush. That's Kiddush b'makom suda, or the biblical obligation has been already fulfilled, but now the rabbinic obligation to say Kiddush over a cup of wine. So now here's where things get tricky. Is that if my obligation, let's assume for argument's sake that, Jen did not daven Ma'ariv, did not, do anything officially to acknowledge the Shabbos. It doesn't mean that it's not Shabbos for her. Of course, it is Shabbos, but she didn't do anything officially to acknowledge the Shabbos. She lit the candles, but that's in and of its own Kabbalah Shabbos. There has to be a formal Vayichulu Hashemayim, a recitation in addition to that. But let's assume for argument's sake, like usually happens, I go to shul Friday night, I come home, and I have, through my saying of davening, I've fulfilled my biblical obligations. I come home, now I have to make Kiddush. My obligation is not any longer anything other than rabbinic. I have fulfilled my biblical obligation. My obligation to make Kiddush is rabbinic in nature. But let's say Jen didn't daven, or didn't say good Shabbos, for whatever the reason. So then her obligation is not only rabbinic to hear Kiddush, but her obligation is biblical. So one who's on a level of rabbinic cannot fulfill the obligation, cannot be motzi somebody else whose obligation's on a higher plane. Her obligation's d'oraisa, my obligation's d'rabbanan. So I could not be able to fulfill halachically correctly her obligation because she's on a higher level than I am. So therefore, it have to be either on the higher level or somebody has to be on a lower level. If I have an obligation d'oraisa and her obligation is d'rabbanan, so technically what that would mean is that she would have to make Kiddush. I could not fulfill her obligation for her. So what she has to do, what everybody has to do, and this is fairly well known is, of course, and this happens, is she says good Shabbos to me when I come home, or she davens, or does anything else to acknowledge the Shabbos verbally. And by acknowledging the Shabbos verbally, so now we're on the same level, Darabanan, rabbinic, and therefore when we're on the same level, Midarabanan, so then I can make Kiddush for her. And that's usually how it goes. But it's very, very important to understand that there's different levels, different statuses. So the question then here in this case is, was it halachically permissible? Was it correct for this fellow to jump the line? Did he figure out a way to jump the line? Now, maybe it's unethical, maybe it's immoral, maybe it's just unjust, maybe it's not right, but maybe it's okay if you just are able to outwit, outsmart, figure out how to get it for whatever the reason, to the front of the line, hoping that everybody else is eventually going to get it. So then, okay, you're able to outwit it, you're able to be smart. Therefore, being smart doesn't have to be to your detriment. It means that maybe it was to your benefit. So that's this question. Does he thinks that he has, it goes to the Rebbe, the case that we're studying here is that he thinks that he has kadima, that he has first spot. He's able to jump the line and therefore is able to get the tzitzis first. This seems to be a rather innocuous case. But what happened in a situation where, again, as we started, what happens if you have an ability to jump the line, to figure out how to know a way to get the vaccine before other people who you hope are going to get it, but you're able to get it for whatever the reason, you have a connection, they're going to waste it, that they're not really being makbid with 75 and plus, 65 and plus, that they're not being so conscientious about it. So if they're not, so all right, let me do whatever I can. Is there a similarity? Are these cases equal? Comments, questions, and concerns before we get to some of the answer. Don't be shy.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
Some men's shirts, like T-shirts, have a vent at the bottom, and it's a very small opening. Does it matter the size of the opening that creates it to have four corners, or just the fact that it's four corners?
Excellent question. Yeah, no, it matters the size. So for example, the polo shirts that many
right.
men wear, yeah. So they have a little V at the bottom. That's not considered significant. It has to be a rove, a majority of the side of the shirt. That's considered four corners. But if it's just like that, then those would be very problematic.
But it's four corners.
Right. It has to be, even though even though it's four corners, it has to measure a certain amount. It has to be a shear. It has to be a measured amount. What's actually interestingly problematic, I know that you might not have noticed this up close, but now that I'll tell it to you, maybe you'll see it, is that a lot of the Hasidic garb, the long jackets, the bekishas, or like the long, they call it the longarekels, the long jackets. Right. So actually many of them are rounded at the bottom. They're rounded at the bottom because some of them, again, I'm not talking about all of them, some of them, because of the garments and the way they're made, would obligate them to put tzitzis on them. And so what they do is they don't have...
Including the Saratuk by the Chabad. If you look at the back of the Chabad, also rounded, correct.
Is that right? Oh, good. Yes. Yeah. What'd you call it?
It's called a Saratuk.
Saratuk.
Sartuk.
Rabbi,
to your point is that you're right. So like if it's rounded, so if it's size and shape, that would obviously determine whether or not it's not
a single vented sports jacket or suit jacket technically might require tzitzis.
Maybe.
In fact, Rav Yoel Ben Nun from Gush Etzion is very famous. He always wears a jacket with, a sports jacket or a suit jacket with tzitzis on them.
Really? Oh, I never saw that. I didn't know.
I didn't look to see if the front quarters are rounded or actually
right. Probably not. Probably they're not. But it would be interesting to see. But again,
But he's well known for that.
Yeah. Got it.
Single vent suit jacket.
Wow, interesting. Yeah. So it does matter the shape, and it certainly does matter the size. But the question then, of course, then becomes like, do you have the right to hop the line? Are you able to hop the line? If you have the ability to do it, is there anything unethical? Is there anything immoral? Something lacking in values? What do you think about that, Gibber? Any thoughts about that? All right, so let's get to
I would think that he's eliminating the possibility of other people getting the tzitzis by doing it first.
I'm saying, is there anything wrong with
there was subterfuge?
Right.
So is there a limited amount of tzitzis?
Right.
Sure.
That's the question. Is there a difference? And I guess this is kind of part of the answer to the vaccine question. Is there a difference between, let's assume there's one dose, and that one dose is either going to go to somebody who should probably be number 2 or number 3 or number 5, or it's going to go to somebody who's, in a bracket, a category that should get it. And you just have the ability to figure out a way because you have connections to get it. So that's different than a situation, perhaps it's different, again, I'll throw that out there. Is that different than a situation where that person is not going to get it anyway? So if they're not going to get it anyway, for whatever the reason, they're not going to get it anyway, is there anything wrong with you getting it? So that means that even though, right, so if you know that they're going to throw out vaccines, it's not like they're going to call the person who should really get it. They're just going to throw them away. So instead of them being discarded, I mean, I personally know scores of people now who literally went that same route. They tracked where vaccines were. I mean, in the hospital, one of the doctors down in Miami Hospital told me that people were literally waiting like hours in line. Not the people that had appointments. At Mount Sinai in Miami, they were waiting, and actually one of the administrators apparently told somebody, I never heard that myself, they didn't tell me that, but apparently one of the administrators told them that this is a trick to the trade. This is what you should do. That if you wait in line, at the end of the day, the vaccines are administered until, let's just, I don't know, I forget the exact example, let's say 5 o'clock, for argument's sake. It's 5 o'clock, you'll stay here, and at 5 o'clock, we'll see what we have left over, and if we have 10 doses, the first 10 people in line, if we have 20, right? So hospitals were getting whatever deliveries of what they were getting, and whatever they weren't giving, the 40% of health professionals are, providers are themselves opting not to take the vaccine. So there have been a lot of theoretically extras. So is anything wrong with that? Now, sure, it can be argued. If you have one and somebody else should get it, then somebody else should get it. Unless, of course, that's the famous question of whether or not chayecha koidmin. If you have one cruise of one flask of water, should you give it to somebody else, or should you take it to yours? Should you save your life or save somebody else's life? I mean, this is a life-saving vaccine. Okay, let's assuming that what they tell us is true. But if it's a life-saving vaccine, you're taking it is essential. So if you can get it, so why do I have to tell somebody else to get it? And the answer is, who has the onus of responsibility to make sure that the people who are supposed to get it get it? If the administrators do not do that, so do you have an obligation, a moral obligation even greater than that? So as Jews who live by the code of Jewish thought and Jewish values, we do anything and everything we possibly can to not just say it, but to live it, to preach it, but to live it, to do it, to make sure that people do it and get what they need to get. So that would seem that they should get it if people want it. But there is a difference, I at least think so. I think there's a difference between whether or not somebody would get it in your stead, or if somebody would not get it in your stead. And therefore, it's just a mass waste. And therefore, if people can get it, they should try to get it. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that it's a difficult question, obviously, because people don't have a straight answer. But if a situation is where they're walking around and they're going to discard the extra, I think you might as well take it, right? Because nobody's going to get it. So you don't want to waste it, because that would seem worse. And the other thing is that, like some of the stories that you heard, I've heard tons of stories where people hear last minute of a place that has opened up and they scurry there. And I'm not sure that they always, sometimes they share the news, but sometimes they don't, because, they have to make sure that they get there. But if we go back to the original case where you're talking about the guy with the tzitzis, I'm a little bit tossed, because I feel like he found like a legal, maybe not such a nice way, but he found a legal way to do something that, to have this mitzvah, I guess. And I'm not saying that it's so nice, but if he hasn't done anything wrong, then it's that situation where you can't fault somebody, but it doesn't seem nice anyway. So I don't know what the ruling is on that.
Let's uncover that a little bit. Let's discuss that, because the question is, is there a moral part of this? Is it not nice? Is it not okay? And if it's not okay, then he shouldn't do it. But what happens if a person, and if it's not okay, what's not okay? What part of it is not okay? I'm not saying I disagree with you. And I think part of what we think about is we have like these attachments to certain codes of ethics, which we are all faithful to as best as we possibly can. It seems as if there's something wrong with it. All right, I agree with you. But what's wrong with it? If we were to point literally to what is it that is wrong with it? What should he be doing? Somebody, no one else is going to act. No one else is going to do it.
Right.
Meaning, let's use the vaccine example, right? If there was a massive demonstration, a group of people that are like, we're taking to the streets peacefully and basically saying it's not right that people who are, under a certain age or not in a certain category, it's not right that they're getting the vaccine before people who should get it. Let's protest. So, okay, so we'll join that. But that's not what's happening. So if that's not what's happening, I mean, if I tell you a hospital administrator told me exactly to me, he did tell me, is that they say 75, but they're not giving to 75. So if they're not giving to 75, so there's somebody who's 55 who wants to get it, should they not try to get it if they themselves are giving it? Meaning who has to be faithful to the law? Is this a function of, and we're going to see at the end of this case, is that the Rebbe makes a decision. But is there anything wrong with what this guy does? If there is, what is it that's wrong?
Are the other people in line, do they have to show that they're able to use the tzitzis? Or did he just go ahead on his own and show that he had a four-cornered garment?
Well, all the Rebbe has is tzitzis. Nobody has a garment. How they're going to get a garment and who they're going to share a garment with, that's yet known to the case. We don't know yet. But here's what he realizes, because it's the circumstances of a DP camp and it's very precarious, he realizes he's got to act quick. So what he's going to do is he's going to tear his garment, and therefore he's going to just jump the gun a little bit. He doesn't know. He's not sure. And therefore, at some point, either they're going to have to share, or there's going to be another garment that's going to be produced, or maybe everybody's going to have to end up doing. Maybe everybody does what he does, but he was just the first one to do it. And because he's the first one to do it, he argues that because he was maybe more of a chacham. I'm in a now halachic situation that precedes anybody else because I have a four-corner garment. So if it's wrong and it feels wrong, and if it doesn't, it's not okay. Like what should be like? Who are the vanguards of the ethics? And if like it's there are sometimes situations where a nice guy finishes last, or maybe that's not true. Maybe that never happens. So is there anything? And if there's something wrong with it, what is it that's wrong with it? I'm welcoming everybody's interpretation.
What feels wrong? It feels wrong to be so blatantly selfish. So I think, right, because if he rushes, if we talk about this guy, so if he rushes and he does what he has to do so that he can have the tzitzis and other people might not be able to, so that feels selfish that he didn't sort of talk to people, hey, I have this idea, let's, and then we can share. Or if we talk about the vaccine and let's say you're, 26 and you somehow slip in, I'm not talking about healthcare workers who should be getting it ahead of people. I'm talking about just somebody off the street. Right. And you go there and just, manage to slip in. Maybe it's because they are taking somebody else's dosages, and so that feels selfish. Right. Maybe that's what to me feels what's wrong.
Right, Carol, would it make a difference if it's just a matter of time? Meaning, so he's going to get to be able to do it first versus, a lottery versus just like what we call a go-round. They'll get to do it, but they're just not going to get to do it yet. They'll get a vaccine, but they're just not going to get the vaccine yet.
Right, and you know what? For me, I don't know because if there are assurances, but I think that there. In the time between somebody getting a vaccine and 6 months from now, when maybe they finished up, countless people could get sick and who knows what. So, there should still be protocol for that kind of thing.
Right. So good. So that adds another layer to this. Is where a person's life is in danger, where it's sakanas nefashos, right?
Right.
So what happens if the next guy is going to take that dose? What if the next guy is going to take your spot? Like, there are morals and ethics. Again, the famous case in the Gemara, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. Person's traveling out in the desert. He's got one flask of water. He's got two people. If they share it, they'll both die. So who gets it? Who gets it? So you're right. Now you add another layer here where this is, the difference between one vaccine and then the second vaccine, and people, the amount of time till everybody gets vaccinated, especially now there's new strains out there, which are now faster and more ferocious. So it seems, so they're reporting. So the intensity of it is, it's people are they're looking at this as sakonis nefashos, and if they can get it, they should get it. And
Right.
they're going to do anything and everything possible. And when you put ethics on the line, I mean, you have to really, there's a lot there. There's a lot there. There's a lot there on the, to figure out, like, what, is there anything wrong with it? I was, I mean, these are conversations I've been literally having for now 10 days, like intensely with lots of people. And, there's a good number of people that are, well in their 80s and 2 people in their 90s that I'm trying to help them get a vaccine. And it's not so simple, believe it or not. It's really not so simple. And they, one state's rules are different than another state's rules. It's not so simple. It's not so simple. But I guess the question then becomes is it not nice? Well, if this guy, jury, I wonder what would happen if this guy would have had like a kind of deliberation by jury, right? He would have had a number of people will come together and says, okay, guys, listen, here's the story. How are we going to do this? I was thinking maybe if I tear my garment, then we'll have one garment. The next guy's going to tear his garment, and he's going to think that he's the first rights. We live in a little bit of a dog-eat-dog world. So if you don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. So does that make it right? Or does you say, no, there's something unethical about it? If it's unethical, like, okay, done. Like the eyes of the Rebbe Shlomo.
But in law, isn't there something like about absence of malice? So if you do something that's not legally wrong, and there's no malice necessarily intended, but it still feels wrong, oh, well, it still was okay just because it feels wrong, oh, well. Even though, again, we go back to the moral compass, but, I don't know how the Gemara will rule, but I'm just saying.
It's very complicated. It's case by case. It's not a simple thing. It's very, very difficult. And we have to understand the uniqueness of the circumstance, the uniqueness of every single case. But sure, the Gemara, the Torah expects us to be morally strong, morally sound, morally faithful, not just like statistically book smart and book bound, but also to be morally bound. But the question is where those areas are. Do we have to be more, if there are cracks and leaks in a system, there's cheating, and then there's like just understanding how a system works. And if you understand how a system works for your benefit and for the benefit of anybody, I'm not saying you should figure out a loophole to avoid paying taxes, God forbid, chas v'shalom. But if in a situation, if you knew, I mean, again, this is what's literally happening. If you knew that they were throwing out vaccines and you had a way to get it, and there was no way to get the people who really should get it, the dosages, is there anything wrong with you getting it? A, and B, if you got it, would you want to tell other people about it? Because how would they feel about you? I know somebody who got it, and they're in that 26 category off the street, but whatever it is, it was their own story. They were able to figure out a way that they knew that it was. And they like waited, and they were the first there. And as they were throwing it out, said, okay, we'll give it to you. That's it. I have, a relative who lives in the state of Tennessee, who, a medical student who just was, a student in school, not in a residency, not in a fellowship, not seeing patients, not doing rounds, none of that. Just the word medical. That was the only thing, that a medical student, right? Mm-hmm. Read a medical journal. They're a medical student. So they had an extra dosage. They gave it to her. Young 20s. What do you think about that, Carol? Anybody?
I think that person was lucky.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Like, right place, right time. So it's a situation where, well, it was going in the garbage tonight anyway. So.
Right. But I guess the question then is right time, right place, right time, right? That's what Mazel stands for, right? Mem, Zayin, Lam, and Makom is place. Zman is time, and Lashon is what you say. You should be at the right place at the right time and say the right thing, right? So, as I was thinking about that example, how much do you have to participate, or can you participate in facilitating the mazel? So, for example, she got in the car. She went to the place. She went with her grandparents. She went with, an aunt and uncle that were elderly. They waited in line for 3.5 hours at a drive-through vaccination site in Tennessee. So was she going to cut the line? She didn't plan to cut the line, but she got in the car. She did what we call hishtadlus. Hishtadlus is she went and she if she was able to get it, she'd be good. If she didn't get it, she would know that it wasn't meant to be. But she got in the car and she said, she pushed, she asked, she said, well, if there's an extra, and it just worked out for her. But the question is, was the efforts that she made, were they okay? It has a happy ending for her, and that's her mazel, and that's her story. If the answer to that question is yes, then it doesn't seem that there would be anything wrong with this fellow creating a situation that he has now a halachic status change. Now, the Rebbe could say that it's very nice you did that, but maybe we'll see that doesn't allow you to have first space, which is how the case is going to conclude. That's what we're going to learn together. But as far as a person's hishtadlus, what a person does to try to put themselves in the best position possible. So in the this young lady who was able to get it. Okay, so if she would have been upset that she didn't get it, I'm not saying she shouldn't be disappointed, but if she didn't get it and she was upset and she was angry and she yelled at somebody and acted, disorderly, if she was made a chil Hashem, if she whatever, that's a different category. She went through all the place, but she invested time, effort, voice. It worked out for her. I know people that, that went thinking that they're hopefully going to get it, and they didn't get it. I mean, this administrator at this hospital who told me that, and a number of people went down there at Mount Sinai Hospital in Miami. People wait at 5:00. Apparently, I don't know if it's daily, but certainly when it first was given there, lots and loads of people were waiting outside the hospital to just wait and see. In fact, somebody once, the very beginning, one of the doctors has said that's what we should do. We should encourage people to go down there and wait. But you have to drive from Boca to go down to Miami. You could sit for hours, then you could get there, and it could be no. Does anybody want to do that? Maybe it's worth it. So this young gal was able to do that while she's sitting in the car with her grandparents, visit with her grandparents. Grandparents got inoculated. Aunt and uncle get inoculated. And here she's in the right place, right time. But she got in the car. She begged them, said that I know that it's a Pfizer vaccine, and I know that about the shelf life, blah, 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 whatever it is. And that's what happened. Anything wrong with that hishtadlus? So it seems like there's nothing wrong with it. And is there anything wrong with this guy doing the same thing? So let's get back to the tzitzis case. And you see where this conversation can go into so many different places, so many different angles, so many different ways. So listen to this. So the answer is in the tshuva and the responsa. Harebi hufta mecharifus chishos shel bachor. He was surprised by the sharpness, by the quickness of this fellow, of this student. He wanted to l'kayim es mitzvah. What he wanted more than anything was to fulfill this mitzvah. And the Rebbe was like, wow, look at this sharpness. This labet malasos v'achriya is a bacher be'etzem. So this is what the Rebbe decided. The Rebbe said to him, he made the following ruling. He says, really, technically speaking, this guy's right. You're right. Listen, there's a deraisa, there's a derabanan, there's a level A, there's a level B, there's a katan, there's a gadol. If you have one pair of tzitzis and it's supposed to go to a katan or a gadol, it goes to a gadol, obviously. So he says, really, that technically speaking, the Rebbe was taken aback by his love for the mitzvahs, want to do the mitzvah, his lavos, his charifus, his sharpness. He says, technically speaking, he's right. However, however, there's something that happened before the guy tore his garment. What happened before the guy tore his garment? So the Rebbe made a decision in his mind. He was machriya, and this is a whole nother conversation, but it's fascinating. We'll touch it for just a minute. Is what you think about. Is your thought, is the machshava considered kemaisa? Is it like a deed? So before he tore his garment, the Rebbe was machlit. He made a decision that he's not going to give it to one person. He's going to do a gorel. He's going to do a lottery. This is what the Rebbe decided. And what we see is the fact that the Rebbe made this hachlata, he made this decision to do a gorel, to do a lottery, that even though this guy outsmarts even that process, once the decision was made by the Rebbe to do a lottery, he's not going to go back on that decision because he then made it available to everybody. Now, he needs a halachic precedent to do that because maybe who says that that's even allowed. The fact that I thought to do it, we know that machshava isn't always kemaisa, which means if I think I'm putting on my tefillin, I didn't put on my tefillin. If I think I'm keeping Shabbos, it doesn't mean I'm keeping Shabbos. There are what we call the sheish mitzvahs tmidios. There are 6 constant mitzvos that if a person simply thinks about them, one is in fulfillment of them. Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim, thinking about God as the ultimate sovereign, the master of the universe, among others, 5 others, right? So we understand that is one expression, that is one example. It's a machshava, but we don't paskin halacha that a machshava is kamaisa. There are those who are careful and worried about that. They say that great rabbinic thinkers, some of them, like the Rambam, for example, became a doctor. When did he have time to study medicine? Because when he would go to the Sherutim, I don't know if it's specifically the Rambam, but others as well, he would go to a place that was not clean, that was not a place you'd study Torah. He wouldn't be able to think about anything other besides Torah. So to distract his mind, he thought about other matters. So the way you think about something, that's going to be what it is. He thought to give it to everybody as a chance, a goyrel, a goyrel. So therefore, since he made that decision, im kain mutelis alav a mitzvah litein as a tzitzis l'misha sheyizke begoyrel. What he planned is that whoever gets it, whoever's lucky enough to win the goyrel, to win the lottery, that's who's going to get it. So we'll see what his halachic precedence is for that. And so therefore, lo yochol lekafeach as kol hapleitim shetzipul ischus begoyrel. So therefore, he felt that he could not take away from all of the refugees who were dying, desirous to want so badly to themselves, also wanted the mitzvah tzitzis. That's what they wanted to do. So he felt that once he made a decision, made achlota, that everyone should have a chance to do it. So that's what it should be. So therefore, l'chein kach yaseh. So therefore, that's what happened. Im kavanos, and he said, im kavanos l'shem shemayim. If it's going to be the will of God that this guy is seviv me'ashamayim shuz yizkeh b'goyrel, if he would win the lottery, so win the lottery, good. And actually it happens, actually this guy won the lottery and he was able to go first. So he was able to go first, not because he tore the garments and therefore was able to go first. He went first because he won the lottery. And because the Rebbe said, I thought to do this first. And so therefore, since this is what I plan to do, this is what's going to happen. And the fact that you outsmarted it, okay, what should I tell you? You outsmarted it. That means you show up to the vaccination site and they just don't have an extra dosage. Okay, what should I tell you? Or they could say we did, or they could themselves be administratively strong and say, you know what? It's true that there are extra vaccines, but we're not going to administer it to you because you're not registered. Now, there might be an ethics, there's a huge ethical question and consequences on the other side of that. If they're just going to throw them out just simply because, that's horrific, that's wrong, it's terrible. But if they're going to then reconstitute them or figure out a way to preserve them or a way to deliver them to audiences and people, personalities who need them, okay, gewaldig. But that's your responsibility. That's your administrative, mandate to do that. If they're not going to do it, they're not going to do it. So what's the precedent for the Rebbe to do this? Like, what's his halachic precedent? So listen to this. This is the second page. V'nira lahavi raya l'svarazu, what happened in the times of the Beis HaMikdash. Mikach shebebeis HaMikdash haya oisim pious. You should know in the Beis HaMikdash, they also did a lottery. They also did a pious. They also did a goyrel. So the Rebbe, when he's making this decision, he's not just simply saying, you know what, nice move, but I thought to do a lottery beforehand, and therefore, tough noogies. No. There's a halachic precedent of what took place in the Beis HaMikdash. What happened in the time of the Beis HaMikdash? Of course, we know, the Mishnah, the Gemara tells us, every one of the Kohanim were very, very desirous to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. They all wanted to be the ones to offer the karbanos of the day. So much so that they would run up the ramp. The Mishnah tells us they would run up the ramp and they would be so desirous to do it, they would like knock each other off the ramp, trample them on the ramp. They would break bones. They would injure each other. There would be very, great discourse and disdain. And therefore they had to think of something. The rabbis knew that if they leave it up to the people, right? Imagine if you had that there wasn't a mechanism of calling people to the Torah for aliyahs. It was just a free-for-all. Anybody who wanted an aliyah could get an aliyah. People would like run up to the Torah. They trample other people. They run over other individuals. You see it just people kissing the Torah. They run over something because I'm so zealous to kiss the Torah. So if I step on your toes, okay, mehecha tesa. No big deal. Answer is there has to be a system. So since in the Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim were so zealous and desirous to serve in the Beis HaMikdash to offer those karbanos of the day, so they ran over each other and they bumped into each other, they injured each other. Ad kedei kach. So they decided that the way they're going to solve this problem is that they're going to create a goyrel. They're going to have a lottery, and whoever's chosen is chosen, and shalom al Yisrael. So the question is, why they do that? Why they make a lottery? We know that there's other situations in halacha where there's something called varei kohen talmud chacham is called the kohen am haaretz. Unrelated, but necessary to this case, related to this case, is what happens if you have two kohanim. One Kohen is a Talmud Chacham, one Kohen is an Am Haaretz. Am Haaretz is an ignoramus. He's an ignoramus or he's a scholar. So who gets precedence? Who gets to bench first? Who gets to eat first? Who gets the truma first? We would give deference to the person who's the Talmud Chacham, who's the scholar, over the ignoramus, obviously, right? So that's what the question is 1 second, why is there a lottery for the Kohanim? I'm sure there were learned, less learned, more learned Kohanim. Just make a very simple rule that we have in Shulchan Aruch, that the more learned Kohanim, they go first. The ignoramus Kohanim, they go second. But they didn't do that. Why didn't they do that? And that's the reason why the Rebbe felt that he had a halachic basis to be able to himself say that there's a goral that was established, and therefore, even though you tore your garment, you don't have precedence. Why? Because why didn't he choose the Talmud Chacham of the Kohanim? But rather you say, you know why? Because everybody has the schus. Everybody has the right to do it. And that even though there's such a concept of Talmud Chacham who comes before an Am Haaretz, every Kohen has the right to offer the karbonos. And the Keva, the Kulam Yesh Schus, and since every one of them has an opportunity to do it, the schus of b'payis, therefore there's a lottery. And therefore, even though there's a learned and a less learned person that's in that population, so each of them have that obligation. Each of them have that right. So too in the case of the tzitzis, we see that there isn't one person who's more of an obligation than less than an obligation. Sure, there are situations where for an aliyah l'torah, the Kohen goes first, for birchas hamazon, he goes first. So then, shetiknu chazal la'olam yikablu. Everybody accepted that. We all understand that. But really, actually, all of the Kohanim, they had that obligation. So since all the Kohanim have the obligation, so therefore that means that there's a pious, and that the ranking system of more learned and less learned is out the window. And so therefore, whoever wins it, wins it. So to here in this case as well. The Rebbe had a halachic precedence to simply say, really everybody, one of the plate and every one of the refugees, they all have an obligation. And since they all have an obligation, I put in my mind, there's going to be a hachlata, there's going to be a pious, there's going to be a goyral. Once there is that precedent for it, I'm not changing my mind. It wasn't just like he, in a whim, he had a feeling, and therefore, since he had a feeling, he's not going to change his mind. No. There's a halachic precedent to how Kohanim were selected to serve in the Beis HaMikdash, and that halachic precedent is the very precedent that he uses to then establish the goyral that everybody, like the Kohanim, were all obligated, and all had the right to it, they all had the schus to it, so to every one of the platim, all of the refugees, all also had the right to do it, and since they had the right to it, there was a goyral. Once he establishes a goyral, the fact that he jumps the line, and even it can be argued that he's an obligation that's d'oraisa, that's a biblical obligation, he has to wait. The fact that he wins the goyral, that's secondary to the story. But the end of the day is that he's going first has nothing to do with the fact that he tore his garment. So that means that there are ethics to going first. Sure, there is a situation where you'd be able to go first. And it seems that if the Rebbe would not have made this hachlata, would not have made this decision to establish this pious, to establish this lottery, so then obviously the rule would have been very clear. Then he would have had to have given it to this fellow that outsmarted the system, no problem. But while that system was not in place, while the system was then in place, I should say, so then once that system was in place, the goral, the establishment of the lottery, so then even though that he does it, he does not have then kadima. And he does not have first treatment. So this is a very interesting nuance. That's how this case closes. But it's interesting how we could apply this to vaccines as well. It depends on the place. It depends on the administrators. It depends on the government. It depends on the states, obviously. It depends on maybe it's a difference if it's a Pfizer versus a Moderna. I mean, again, there's probably lots of different layers, which is why it's a case-by-case situation. But while we're dealing with situations where some people are hopping the line, sometimes people are hopping the line and it's halachically okay. And there's some people that are hopping the line that it's halachically not okay. If it's going to be not administered, it's not going to be given to somebody else, okay, then you should get it. Or if you are functioning in a capacity that you should otherwise be able to have it, then get it. And if not, then there are ethics that demand that there needs to be significant attention given to where it is that the morals and the values have to then play a forefront in the decision-making of what people do in vaccine and really truly in everything and everywhere in life.
Lots of show us stories that we talk about the same type of things that happen, right?
Yeah. Largely because it is those were really cases which became incubators for seeing how devoted and how much effort was done to fulfill a mitzvah, and whether that's I mean, I know that over the years people have asked and questioned, Chayecha Kodman, your life is, your life is first, and was there a need to smuggle the tefillin at the possibility for which the tzitzis that maybe a person's life was in danger? I mean, we're inspired by these stories and we're horrified by these stories all in one. But sure, the uniqueness and actually what I'm thinking about, Jerry, is that we sometimes take for granted, we can just pick up a phone and order 10 pairs of tzitzis and right? You agree? What do you got there? Oh, we're going to the cabinet.
Well, you're thinking, can I ask you a question?
Sure, of course.
Let's say that that he didn't have a thought about that beforehand. Can he still say, I didn't think of this beforehand, but when I go and try to decide, there is this precedent about the gorel. So like, does he have to have had the thought ahead of time?
I think so. Yeah. I think so. It's a good question. Like,
Otherwise, the guy could have just been the winner because he was first come.
That's right.
Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Right. Meaning he was there. It worked out. You know what I'm saying? You can't then you can post it, after that, then he can say, oh, wow, this guy's outsmarted. Maybe other people will do that. Let me figure out a way to get everybody now vaccinated or everybody to wear the tzitzis. But if that didn't happen first, you have to give kadima to the person who wins it. He put himself in a halachic position where he actually was first. And if it wasn't for the fact that the Rebbe thought about it in advance, it's a great foresight to be able to think about it as such in advance. But if he didn't think about it in advance, you couldn't then just decide that, really it's not so fair. So there's really have to I made a achlata. I didn't make a achlata. I didn't do that. So.
Rabbi, I had a sort of side question about one of the principles you had mentioned. Like we know for Aliyah Torah, it's established norm that there's going takes precedent, Levi and so on. But let's say for benching and so on, or some other kibbutz, you always say the chacham trumps the amaretz. That doesn't. There are other reasons to give the amaretz before the chacham that are equally valid.
Such as?
Kavod a chacham or kavod a Torah.
Such as?
Such as the Amoritz would never have the opportunity or rarely have the opportunity to go up to the Torah and make a mitzvah. You're
just a nice guy. And we live in times that we're very sensitive to try to, we're fishing constantly. We're fishermen. I'm telling you, whenever I'm on the famous elevator pitch, you're on floor 22 and you got to get down to the lobby. So somebody says that, so excuse me, sir, what do you do for a living? So I will sometimes say I'm a doorman, because that right the way. And by the time they look at me with a little inquisitively, so they're out and I'm out. That's it. I'm a doorman. Or sometimes they'll say I'm a fisherman. When you're a fisherman, so you're fishing, you're looking. Answer is that you're a nice guy. You want to give somebody who has not had an opportunity. The question is, where emotion and halacha intersect. It might not be correct. It just might not be correct. I mean, listen, there's so many different examples of that. I'll tell you just one nice story. You remember a number of years ago when Rabbi Lau was here for Shabbos, right? Remember he came as a Skan resident, for those of you who I know predates you, but you guys remember those who were there? Yeah. So we had a dinner Friday night at my house. And Rabbi Lau was in my home, and we had a very, very nice, elaborate, fancy dinner. I think, Carol, we sat at the same table, if I remember correctly. Remember that?
Yeah, I do remember.
Right. So it was at our house. It was beautiful. It was very nice. It was catered. Right? So what do you do when Rabbi Lau's at your house Friday night for dinner? Right. So now comes time. We sing Shalom Aleichem. We sing Eshes Chayil. And now it's time, to make Kiddush, to make Hamotzi. So I told Rabbi Lau when he arrived, I'm like, Rabbi, I am just your assistant deputy. You need a glass of water, I'm your guy. You need me to fold your towels, I'm your guy. You want me to hold your papers, want me to hold the stander, I'm your guy. You want to sneeze, there'll be a tissue. I'm that guy. I have nothing else, zero, period. So I went over to the rabbi, brought him the cup, the glass, he should make Kiddush. He says, I'm not doing it. I said, why? He says, it's the balabais. He says, it's your house. I said, Rabbi, I can't do it. I can't do it. It just cannot happen. I'm so sorry. And here we're about to have, now remember, we've already had, I won't call it an argument. I got him to Florida on an argument. I told him that, Mayor wanted to see him. And I said, and he knows Zazma Makom until the rabbi agrees to come. And he thought it was cute. And he gave me a pinch and he booked his tickets and he came. I said, Rabbi, please, I can't do it. People waiting. It's Kiddush. I can't. I'm not making Kiddush if the chief rabbi's in my house. I'm not making a motzi. I'm going to leave. I'm going to run away. I don't know. He says, you can't do it. He says, I can't do it. You have to do it. You're the balabais. So I'm thinking, and b'siyata d'shmaya, with God's help, I got a thought in my head, Chazdei Hashem, and I figured out a way to convince him how to do it. And this was really, I was so thankful. How did I convince Rabbi Lau to do it? I said, Rabbi, if the Rav will remember, and this is going back, there's 10 years earlier, Rabbi Lau was a guest on the Upper West Side, and he davened in our shul. For Shalashudis in the afternoon, and he was going to speak at Shalashudis. And it happens to be that Shabbos there was a Sheva Brachos. And at the Sheva Brachos, they made a Sheva Brachos at Shalashudis, at the Shalashudis after the minyan. And the rabbi, our Rav, Rabbi Chatzkel Besser, should have an enhanced Gan Eden. He was a very special tzaddik, a lichtige Gan Eden, a very special person, very close to our family, us to him to us. So I remember, when it got to the Sheva Brachos, when it got to the benching, he gave every single one of the Sheva Brachos to Rabbi Lau. And he said to the shul, he says, when the chief rabbi, the Rav Rashi, comes to your town, he gets all of the kibbudim. That's just what happens. He gets all of the kibbudim. He's the Rav Rashi. So I said, Rabbi Lau, I learned from my Rav that when the Rav Rashi comes to town, he takes all of the kibbudim. He said literally all the Sheva Brachos. I've never seen one person do all of the Sheva Brachos except for when I had to do them, there was nobody else to do it. He had all of the Sheva Brachos. There were a lot of Rabbanim that were there. He had all of the Sheva Brachos. And the Rav said, when the chief rabbi, when a man like Rabbi Lau comes, he gets all of the kibbudim. So I said, Rabbi, I'm just learning from my Rav. My Rav said that when the chief rabbi comes into your proximity, he has to have all of the kibbudim. And for the second time, he took my cheek, he pinched it very hard. He says, okay, I'm going to make Kiddush. I'm going to make a motzi. And he made Kiddush. He made a motzi. And that was it. And it was gewaldig. See, the chief rabbi. What am I supposed to say? So there are situations where, even though you might think that, yes, you're a nice guy, Mark, you're still a nice guy. And yes, we do try to give kibbudim and honors and introduce those who might not be as familiar. But there are also rules that we have to follow. And those rules require us to sometimes stick with the Talmud Chacham before the Am Haaretz.
Can the Talmud Chacham defer?
That's also a good question. Not always. No, like you have a Kohen. A Kohen can't be mochel on his cover.
Well, I know a Kohen can't.
Right. So it's far less strict with a Talmud Chacham, because I can say I'm a Talmud Chacham. Who says I'm a Talmud Chacham? You can read 2 articles on Chabad.org and to somebody else, you're a Talmud Chacham, So the answer is that you can be more, there's more of a makom to be mochli or covered in the case of a Talmud Chacham Am Haaretz than a Kohen and a non-Kohen. So, all right, we're at the top of the hour. That means it's lunchtime. Hope everybody is going to have a meaningful rest of your Monday. Great week. So wonderful to learn with all of you. Thanks so much for tuning in. Look forward to seeing everybody. Thank you for your questions, Carol and everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Linda. Same bad time, same bad channel. A beautiful week. Healthy, happy, and safe.
Thanks.
Right.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.